In the year 1819, the Sikh army under Maharaja Ranjit Singh of Punjab annexed the valley of Kashmir, thereby ending 60 years of Afghan rule, often considered the darkest period in Kashmir's history. But about 130 years later, the valley and the entire province of Kashmir was thrown into chaos as Pakistan and the British eyed it for various reasons. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are talking about Kashmir and the events that unfolded soon after India's independence and the partition. Historically, the term Kashmir was used to refer the valley lying between the Great Himalayas and the Pir Panjal range. Today, when we refer to Kashmir, we are talking about the province of Kashmir, which consists of 4 distinct regions, starting with the Valley of Kashmir, with Jammu towards the southwest, and Ladakh to the northeast, and Gilgit-Baltistan to the northwest. Historically, Kashmir was an important center of Hinduism and later also of Buddhism. And some of the earliest references to the valley and the name Kashmir come from the Nilamata Purana, which is a 6th century text, and also later one of the most important chronicles of the 12th century, that is Kalhana's Rajat Rangini, which traces the history of the kings of Kashmir. The modern history of Kashmir, though, starts in 1819 with the conquest of the Kashmir Valley by the advancing Sikh armies under Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the king of Punjab. And with that conquest ended almost 4 centuries of Muslim rule in the valley under the Mughals and the Afghans. Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the Lion of Punjab and founder of the Sikh Kingdom of Punjab, which he ruled between 1801 and 1839. And during his reign, even the British tried to stay on good terms with him. The Maharaja, to a great extent, influenced the map of North India at that time. He was a brilliant general, an astute statesman, and a very able administrator. Now, before the annexation of Kashmir in 1819, the Sikh army had also captured the kingdom of Jammu, which was south of the Kashmir Valley. And in later years, one of the grandnephews of that erstwhile king of Jammu, Gulabh Singh, sought service at the court of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. He distinguished himself in various campaigns and was instrumental in the annexation of the Kashmir Valley in 1819 to the Sikh kingdom. And subsequently, in 1820, Gulabh Singh was made the Raja of Jammu. Gulabh Singh hailed from the Dogra dynasty, and he was instrumental in extending the boundary of Kashmir beyond the Kashmir Valley. After obtaining approval from Maharaja Ranjit Singh, Gulabh Singh started the Dogra Tibetan War in May of 1841 under the command of a very able general, Zorawar Singh. Ladakh was annexed by the Dogra army. Unfortunately, General Zorawar Singh was killed in battle as he tried to move further into Tibetan territory. Subsequently, the Treaty of Chushul was signed in August of 1842, and it set the boundary between the Dogra kingdom and Tibet at the end of Ladakh. So the Dogra kingdom was able to annex Ladakh, and this was formally signed via the Treaty of Chushul. And the treaty included keeping the trade route between Lhasa and Leh open for trade between the Dogra kingdom and Tibet. And that was the primary reason why Gulabh Singh invaded Ladakh to get access to the traditional trade route between Lhasa and Leh. While conquering Ladakh, Raja Gulabh Singh also looked westward towards Baltistan, which was known as Little Tibet at that time, and brought it under his control in 1840. And that laid the foundation for the future expansion of that region so that they could take control of the trade routes to Kashmir and Central Asia. Now, Gulabh Singh had a long-term vision for this region from a trade and commerce perspective. So when the First Anglo-Sikh War broke out in 1845, post the death of Maharaja Ranjit Singh in 1839, Gulabh Singh maintained a neutral stance to an extent where he even ended up being the mediator and the trusted advisor to Sir Henry Lawrence, the British resident of Lahore. The British were trying to bank on the chaos after the death of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and the neutrality of Gulabh Singh helped them a lot in gaining an upper hand over the Sikh army and eventually defeating it in the First Anglo-Sikh War. At the end of the Second Anglo-Sikh War in 1846, two treaties were signed, the Treaty of Lahore and the Treaty of Amritsar. The Treaty of Lahore handed the state of Lahore, that is West Punjab, to the British, and the Treaty of Amritsar handed the province of Jammu and Kashmir, including the region of Ladakh, formally to Gulabh Singh, and Gulabh Singh was recognized by the British as the Maharaja of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. After the First War of Indian Independence in 1857, also known as the Rebellion of 1857, which led to Queen Victoria taking over formally as Kaiser-e-Hind, or the Empress of India, from the British East India Company. And at that time, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir came under the paramountcy of the British Crown. In other words, in 1857, when Queen Victoria and the British Crown took over the governance of India, all the independent Maharajas became known as the princely states, and they owed allegiance to the British Crown, which meant they paid their share of taxes to the British Crown and ensured that there was no rebellion within the state against the Crown, and in exchange, the British Crown allowed them to independently manage their provinces or states. So from 1846, after the Treaty of Amritsar, through 1947, when India became independent, the province of Jammu and Kashmir was ruled by the Dogra dynasty. And during this time, the kingdom also expanded, adding the areas of Hunza, Gilgit, and Nagar to the kingdom. The four Dogra rulers who ruled the state during this time were, in chronological order, Gulabh Singh, Ranbir Singh, Pratap Singh, and Hari Singh. So in 1947, when India's independence was announced, along with the partition into India and Pakistan, Maharaja Hari Singh was the Maharaja of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, just one point to mention here is that as Kashmir expanded towards northwest, including Gilgit-Baltistan in its domain, its external borders touched China and Afghanistan, which meant, to some extent, there was a close proximity to the Soviet Union. And that made it strategically very important to the British. And as a result, in 1935, the Gilgit region was converted into an agency, and that area was leased from the Maharaja for a period of 60 years. That means that even though the state was under the direct administration of the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir, the Gilgit agency was an autonomous or a semi-autonomous unit of British India whose external affairs were governed by an agent who reported directly to the Viceroy of India. That meant it was more of a maintaining the strategic boundaries between the British and its enemies, and any intelligence information that was meant to be sent to the Crown was sent to the Viceroy directly rather than being sent to the Indian Maharaja too. So this 60-year lease agreement meant that in 1995, the Gilgit region would be returned to being administered by the province of Jammu and Kashmir. And then, on February the 20th, 1947, British Prime Minister Clement Attlee announced that the British government would grant full self-government to British India by 30th of June 1948, and the future of princely states would be decided after the date of the final transfer was decided. Subsequently, on June the 3rd, the Mountbatten Plan was announced, which stated that the princely states had the right to join either Pakistan or India based on two major factors: geographical contiguity and the people's wishes, which meant that the province of Jammu and Kashmir under Maharaja Hari Singh had to decide whether it wanted to accede to Pakistan or India. Around the tenure of Maharaja Hari Singh, another political figure emerged in Kashmir: Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah. In 1932, he formed the Muslim Conference as a political party in the Kashmir Valley, and his aim was to fight for the rights of all oppressed sections of society, and not just Muslims alone. He ended up building a good rapport with Nehru, who would move on to be India's Prime Minister post-independence, and it was under Nehru's influence that he changed the name of Muslim Conference to National Conference, focusing on secularism and equality rather than focused on a religion. On paper, he displayed a passion for democracy, equality, and as a result, he built a great rapport with Nehru. Within Kashmir, he proposed a democratic constitution and protested against the existing rule of the Maharaja in an effort to democratize the valley. Some of his demands were met, but overall, because of the constant nature of protests, he was put into jail at different points in time. Subsequently, in 1946, Sheikh Abdullah launched the Quit Kashmir movement, which was essentially asking the Maharaja to quit Kashmir. Yes, while Gandhi started the Quit India movement against the British in 1942, Sheikh Abdullah started the Quit Kashmir movement against the Maharaja in 1946. So upon start of the Quit Kashmir agitation, Sheikh Abdullah was arrested and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. So moving forward to 1947, when the British announced that the princely states, along with Kashmir, could decide whether they wanted to accede to India or Pakistan, Hari Singh's Diwan or Prime Minister, Ramchandra Kak, suggested that the Maharaja accede to Pakistan. And the reason for that was Pakistan's founder and head of Muslim League, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had been wooing all the princely states and suggesting to them that if they acceded to Pakistan, they would retain all their rights over their subjects and they could operate independently under the Pakistan government. This meant the Maharaja could retain status quo post the independence of the subcontinent. And if he acceded to India, his concern was that Sheikh Abdullah's closeness to Nehru may resurrect him as a viable political entity against him, and he did not want to see that happen. However, by the time of the announcement of independence and the partition of the subcontinent, Jinnah's activities had become too communal. There was too much of communal incitement, starting with the Direct Action Day, that The Maharaja was concerned that the communal disharmony could be unleashed on his subjects, especially when he had a sizable non-Muslim minority. The valley was primarily Muslim, so was the Gilgit-Baltistan area. Ladakh was majority Buddhist, and Jammu was majority Hindu. So contrary to popular opinion, very early in this decision making, the Maharaja had started leaning towards India from the point of accession. And towards that, the Queen Tara Devi and Crown Prince Karan Singh was sent to Lahore to meet up with Justice Meher Chand Mahajan, justice at the East Punjab High Court in Lahore, to offer him the post of the next Diwan or Prime Minister in Hari Singh's court. Now, Justice Meher Chand Mahajan was a member of the Indian National Congress, and the Maharaja felt that he would be in a better position to negotiate Kashmir's accession to India with the leadership of the Indian National Congress, like Nehru and Sardar Patel. Meher Chand Mahajan did not readily accept the offer. He said he was going to ponder on it, and in the meantime, he ended up being appointed to the Boundary Commission that was going to draw the boundaries between India and Pakistan under Cyril Ratcliffe. So on August 16, 1947, a day after India's independence, Maharaja Hari Singh fired Ramchandra Kak and placed him under house arrest. Subsequently, on September the 13th, Meher Chand Mahajan took over as the new Diwan or Prime Minister of Kashmir. And his immediate task was to start the negotiation for the accession of the state to India. Pakistan Times reported on September the 26th that Kashmir had decided to join the Indian Union and that the decision had been taken 2 weeks earlier. 2 weeks earlier, meaning when Meher Chand Mahajan assumed the office of Prime Minister. At this point, one has to mention the award of 3 tehsils within the Gurdaspur district to India as part of the partition by Cyril Ratcliffe. Pakistan has often alleged that the British were partisan towards India by awarding 3 tehsils from the Gurdaspur district to India despite there being a thin Muslim majority. The reason, though, is that Cyril Ratcliffe had maintained that though the population distribution would be the key factor between awarding areas to Pakistan versus India, however, a natural land boundary could overrule that. And in this case, the natural land boundary was the river Ravi. So out of the 4 tehsils or townships within Gurdaspur, Shakargarh went to Pakistan because it was on the west of the river Ravi, and Pathankot, Gurdaspur and Batala landed on the Indian side because they were on the eastern side of the river Ravi. And that meant Kashmir had a direct land route to the rest of India via Pathankot. And right around the time it became clear that the Maharaja was planning on acceding to India, Pakistan Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan convened a secret meeting in Lahore to discuss the annexation of Kashmir. A 3-pronged strategy was discussed, starting with the economic blockade of Kashmir. The Maharaja had a standstill agreement with Pakistan for the supply of fuel and food items to the valley, and by placing the valley on an economic blockade, he was essentially cutting off their food supply. The second part involved inciting rebellion among the Muslims in the border areas of Poonch and Mirpur, so that the Maharaja would have to move his army from the north on to Jammu and Mirpur to maintain peace, and that would open the third prong in the strategy, Operation Gulmarg. the code name for a full-blown invasion of the valley via Muzaffarabad with the aim of occupying the capital city of Srinagar following the Uri-Baramulla road. The aim was to send tribals from the northwest frontier province into Srinagar, and once Srinagar was occupied, Pakistan Army had a brigade in standby mode ready at Abbottabad to get to Srinagar in a few hours as soon as it had fallen to the tribesmen. Now, between September and October, after Meherchand Mahajan took over as the Diwan in the Maharaja's court, there was a lot of back and forth that happened between Kashmir and New Delhi. The Maharaja had made up his mind to accede to India, but Nehru had some conditions for the accession. The primary being free Sheikh Abdullah and make him part of the government in Kashmir. Now, the reason for that was that around that time, the province of Junagadh had a Muslim ruler with a Hindu majority, and he was trying to accede to Pakistan. And the Indian government was sending military over to Junagadh to ensure that the people's will was taken into consideration and the ruler was not unilaterally acceding to Pakistan. So, applying the same logic, it was important that Kashmir too incorporated the voice of its people. And in this case, Sheikh Abdullah was the true representative of the Muslim majority Kashmir Valley. So, him being in the government was very important to ensure that the accession to India was legitimate and constitutional. Sheikh Abdullah was finally released on September the 29th and placed under house arrest. And after a lot of back and forth, finally he flew to New Delhi to meet with Nehru. Now, by the end of September, both the Indian government and the Maharaja knew of the buildup of Kabali tribesmen along the border states ready to infiltrate Kashmir. So, the Maharaja was very eager to sign the instrument of accession. But including Sheikh Abdullah in his government was still something that he was not ready to do. And while he was procrastinating on this front, Pakistan launched Operation Gulmarg on October the 22nd, 1947, under the command of two of its commanders, while sending Kabali tribesmen into Kashmir. The tribesmen crossed the border into Muzaffarabad, and one of the first casualties of this invasion was the Wazir of Wazarat, or governor of Muzaffarabad, Duni Chand Mehta, who was shot dead by the invading tribesmen after he and his team ran out of artillery to defend themselves and the district. And 4 days later, the Maharaja finally acceded to the request to include Sheikh Abdullah in his government and signed the instrument of accession with India. So on September 26, 1947, India was ready to deploy troops to save Kashmir from the tribal invasion. Since the tribesmen were just a few hours away from Srinagar, Colonel Sam Manekshaw, yes, the same Sam Manekshaw who would go on to become General Sam Manekshaw during the 1971 Bangladesh War, suggested an airlift of the troops to Srinagar airport rather than taking the land route to gain time on the raiders and start pushing them back. The province of Jammu and Kashmir was finally an integral part of the Union of India. Meanwhile, in Gilgit-Baltistan, the British had suddenly prematurely ended the 60-year lease and handed the region back to the Maharaja on August 1, 1947. The anticipation at the time was that Kashmir would be acceding to Pakistan, so the British would be able to maintain their access control over this region. But when Kashmir acceded to India, the British were shell-shocked, and immediately two officers of the Gilgit Scouts, Major W.A. Brown and Captain A.S. Matheson, instigated an uprising of the Muslim troops within the garrison and arrested the governor, Brigadier Ghansara Singh, and asserted that the Gilgit-Baltistan region had acceded to Pakistan. And for his connivance with the British, in 1948, the emperor awarded the most exalted order of the British Empire to Major W.A. Brown. Now, by the end of 1947, most of the tribesmen had been pushed back into Muzaffarabad, and at this point, the regular Pakistani army started stepping in and waging mini battles along the border areas, including Ladakh. Across Kashmir and Ladakh, there was no support for the Pakistani army or the tribesmen who had invaded earlier. And there were some heroic stories, including one of Maqbool Sherwani, a resident of Baramulla, who misdirected the tribesmen when they were trying to get to Srinagar, giving the Indian army valuable time to get to the Srinagar airport before the raiders could get there. The other one was of a young engineering graduate from the University of Sheffield, Sonam Narbo, a resident of Ladakh, who used his engineering prowess to complete the construction of a 2,300 yards long airstrip in just 3 weeks by April of 1948, which enabled the Indian Army to land their men along with military equipment so that the incoming Pakistani army could be pushed back. By December of 1947, Nehru approached the United Nations in a hope to get Pakistan a reprimand from the United Nations for invading Kashmir. Several resolutions were passed by the United Nations which recommended that Pakistan withdraw all its tribesmen and forces from the province of Jammu and Kashmir, while India maintained a minimal troop strength so the UN could conduct a referendum in the province. All this was rejected by Pakistan because it feared that the referendum could go India's way and it would lose all the territory that it had gained up till now. In 1950, though, Sir Owen Dixon, an Australian jurist, came up with the Dixon Plan, which suggested that Jammu and Ladakh, being primarily Hindu and Buddhist, go to India, whereas Gilgit and Muzaffarabad and Mirpur stay with Pakistan, and the Valley of Kashmir undergo a referendum to determine which country it would go to. Pakistan rejected this outright, and the primary reason was the reason that Pakistan invaded Jammu and Kashmir in the first place: the Indus River water system. The river Indus, with its source being the Mansarovar Lake in Tibet, flowed through Ladakh. It was the trio of the Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab, which formed part of the Indus River water system, that provided water to Pakistan. So as long as Ladakh was in India, India was controlling the flow of river water to Pakistan. And that is what Pakistan was most paranoid about. By end of 1948, the Indian forces had pretty much regained Zojila and Kargil and secured Ladakh, as well as driven Pakistan out of the Kashmir Valley. And right at that moment, as the army was still advancing, Nehru gave the instruction to stop and went for a ceasefire, which was signed on January the 1st, 1949. Why stop at that point? The primary reason being, Sheikh Abdullah informed Nehru that his influence was restricted only with the Kashmiri-speaking people. The regions of Muzaffarabad, Mirpur, etc. had Punjabi Muslims, and Nehru was concerned that in case of a plebiscite or a referendum, these regions would vote for Pakistan. Hence the instruction to the Indian troops to maintain the ceasefire line right where they had stopped. And that concludes this section of today's program. On to the quiz section. Question from the last episode. Under what scenario does Ukraine have a runoff election to decide its president? Ukraine requires its president to have more than 50% of the vote to be declared president. So the answer is B. No candidate has received 50% of the vote. Question for today's episode. The Baghdad Pact of 1955 was signed by Great Britain and 4 other countries, and its main purpose was to block possible expansion by the Soviet Union into the Middle East. Who were the 4 other participants and signatories to the Baghdad Pact? Is it A, Iran, Iraq, Israel, and Egypt? B, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt? C, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Pakistan? Or D, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, and Turkey? Once again, who were the 4 signatories along with Great Britain to the 1955 Baghdad Pact, whose main purpose was to block possible expansion by the Soviet Union into the Middle East? A, Iran, Iraq, Israel, and Egypt? B, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt? C, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Pakistan? Or D, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, and Turkey? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, we move slightly west into Balochistan and see how its fortunes change after the British decide to leave the subcontinent in 1947. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.